Next, another in our series of Black History Month conversations. This week marks the 25th anniversary of the death of Malcolm X, a black leader of the 60s. Malcolm X wrote in his autobiography that his whole life had been a chronology of changes. He was born Malcolm Little in 1925, a dropout who became a streetwise hustler known as Big Red. In 1946, he was convicted of burglary and sent to prison. There, he converted to the Islamic religion. Upon release, he began speaking out on the teachings of its leader, Elijah Muhammad, who espoused black pride and separateness.
They call Mr. Muhammad a black supremacist because he teaches you and me not only that we're as good as the white man, but better than the white man.
Malcolm X, as he was renamed, became the voice of the black Muslim movement. He publicly expressed rage and contempt for white America's racist attitudes.
The white man is the oppressor.
And when he urged black Americans to stand up and fight force with force, it created a backlash in white America. In 1964, he split with the black Muslim movement to form his own group dedicated to black nationalism. After a pilgrimage to Mecca and travels throughout Africa, Malcolm X moved away from his rigid black separatist ideology, and upon his return, he pushed for greater unity between black Americans and Africans struggling for freedom. On February 21st, 1965, as he was about to address a rally in Harlem, he was gunned down. He was 39 years old. Recently, Charlayne Hunter-Gault spoke to Paul Lee, who has spent 16 years studying Malcolm X.
In its current issue, Emerge magazine writes, 2 decades ago, Malcolm X was feared by most white America and misunderstood by a large segment of black Americans. Why was that?
That's largely because before 1963, the predominant image of the movement was Southern, nonviolent, and conciliatory. The dominant image that most Americans had of black Americans' struggle for freedom and for rights was that of Martin Luther King. And then in 1963, Malcolm exploded. And at that time, Malcolm was advocating the philosophy of Elijah Muhammad, and they declared that not only did they not want to integrate with the white man, but that he was a devil and deserved to be separated from. And you can imagine how that went down. You remember, this is the period of the March on Washington, and people are talking about brotherhood. The white man as a devil was really never that important a feature of the Nation of Islam's philosophy. What was more important was Malcolm's historical indictment of what he saw as the wrongs of the white race against the colored race throughout history.
Now, when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad comes along and begins to list the historic deed, the historic attitude, the historic behavior of the white man in this country toward the black people in this country, again, the white people are so guilty that they can't stop doing these things to make Mr. Muhammad appear wrong, so they hide their wrong by saying that he is teaching hatred. History is not hatred.
And the other part, that he was misunderstood by black Americans. What light can you shed on that?
That's largely because most black Americans got their news through the white-controlled press. And so they shared many of the same perceptions that white people did. Unless they got a chance to see Malcolm on television or hear him on the radio or hear him speak, usually their impressions would have been colored by what the white press projected. And the white press was quite hostile.
What image was it projecting, and how different was that from what you perceived to be the reality?
There were 3 dominant images. The first was that Malcolm and the Nation of Islam preached hate. The second was that they advocated indiscriminate violence against whites. And the third was that they were opposed to the civil rights movement. White people tended to focus on the indictment and to infer that that meant that black Americans, that is the Nation of Islam, the Muslims, hated them and wanted to do them harm. But in fact, white people would be hard-pressed to find black people more courteous than the Muslims. They would typically call you sir or ma'am, and they scrupulously obeyed the law.
But it was a time when there was a lot of fear on the part of blacks and whites. I remember people feared the stolid fruit of Islam, which was the paramilitary guards in the Nation of Islam. They feared the whole idea of separateness that black Muslims were preaching, because the civil rights movement was about integration.
The emphasis of the movement was pro-black, and it was more pro-black than it could be considered anti-white. But a lot of white people found that hard to stomach, that there were black people. Now, historically, black people have been rejected by white people, and now it was reversed, where you had black people rejecting them.
Part of it, as I remember, was fear of the rhetoric. I mean, when Malcolm X talked about freedom by any means necessary.
Malcolm believed in the philosophy of the cocked fist, and sometimes in order to be able to get white people to move, he felt that you had to put forth a threat. He thought, for instance, that nonviolence, the tactic of nonviolence and the philosophy of nonviolence gave those who wanted to oppress black people a blank check on our lives and on our property. You could attack us and destroy our property with impunity. And so Malcolm's advocacy of self-defense and at times even retaliatory violence was designed to let them know that if you want to try to do that, there's a price that has to be paid.
I've never at any time made any statement that anybody can even interpret to indicate that I believe in initiating acts of aggression or violence indiscriminately against people. But I do believe when people are being oppressed and are the victims of brutality, that they are within their rights to defend themselves. And when they defend themselves, in my opinion, this is not violence. This is self-defense.
What was his relationship to the civil rights movement, to Martin Luther King, and that whole era?
There were deep philosophical disagreements. Initially, when the civil rights movement began to rise in earnest in the mid and late 1950s, the Nation of Islam was then very small. But they did try to initiate united front efforts at an early stage. Once they began to be vocal and the stigma of hate and violence was attached to them, the civil rights movement moved back. When they moved back with a vengeance and began to attack the Nation of Islam. It was only a relatively short period, however, that Malcolm did respond tit for tat with the attacks that had come from the mainstream civil rights leaders. But that has been the image that has been burned into the minds of most people who remember that era. After Malcolm X was expelled from the Nation of Islam, however, he made a number of concerted efforts to unify the movement again, but this time on a broader level. He did not try to say, for instance, that you had to be Muslim or that you had to have this particular political approach. He thought that the problems of our people were so vast that it would take the concerted efforts of everyone. He used to joke about somebody has first base and somebody has second base. He said that if a bear attacks me and a dog grabs one leg and a cat or a fox grabs the other leg, I'm not going to disagree with the particular animals. Anything that help get this bear off of me is okay.
One of the things that I've read is that there was a strategy, I don't know if it actually existed, but that Malcolm X used to say that he deliberately was as radical as he was in order to help Martin Luther King get his program advanced.
Most of the focus on Malcolm and Dr. King has been on their personal opinion of each other and their personal relationship. They only, in fact, met one time. What they have missed is what you're alluding to. That is, they worked almost hand in glove on a tactical level. Dr. King would, for instance, create these crisis scenarios in Birmingham or St. Augustine and Selma. And Malcolm would use the injustices created by these scenarios to help push forth his indictment of America. At the same time, Dr. King was able to use Malcolm's extremist image to say, look, unless you give me concessions, this man is waiting in the wings.
There are those who study both the life of Martin Luther King and the life of Malcolm X who say that they represented different demographic poles, that Martin Luther King was the man of the Deep South, that Malcolm X was the man of the urban North. Is that a correct analysis of where they were in their time?
I think you're right. I think that they did represent different constituencies. As much as they spoke to different constituencies, I think your point is well taken. They represented them. Malcolm sprung from the urban, northern urban experience and represented it well. Dr. King likewise sprung from the southern, more rural experience and represented as well as spoke for that. They did represent different aspects of black American culture in the same way that Malcolm was misunderstood by many white Americans because of the cultural differences. In Malcolm's case, however, the problem of understanding him properly was exacerbated by one of Malcolm's unique qualities, and that was the ability to grow radically and rapidly. After Malcolm began to travel especially, he revised his view of his religion, that is Islam, and the Islam that he came to understand, taught that you don't judge a person by the color of their skin, but by their deeds. It was during this period, that is Malcolm's last year, that the greatest changes took place. Fundamentally, Malcolm felt that African Americans needed to become an international people. He felt that the world was getting too small for us to be parochial in our concerns. As he used to say, waves that are set forth in one part of the world will eventually affect conditions in another part of the world.
Negroes in this country are beginning to realize that we are not a minority. We're only a minority in the American context. But in the worldwide context, we are part of the majority of oppressed people who are struggling against their oppressor or oppression. And this is what changes the thinking and also the tactics of even American Negroes in their struggle for freedom.
One of the areas he became most strongly concerned with was Africa. He saw South Africa as the last bastion of white supremacy and felt that the most protracted battle for the liberation of Africa would take place there.
You were 5 years old when Malcolm died. I mean, where did this driving passion to find out all about him, where did that come from?
It started as a search for identity. When I was about 14 or 15, the world began to change in relationship to me in anticipation of me becoming a man. And one of the most pronounced changes I noticed was on the part of white people, and they would step back from me in elevators and treat me more brusquely or even rudely. And I was absolutely puzzled by this. They did not know me, and I was trying to understand on what basis have you judged me. And what I understood the basis was that I was black. So my historical researches began in trying to understand that racial category that I'd been lumped in. What Malcolm gave me was history as a tool to explain the world. He allowed me to draw lines and at least be able to give tentative explanations to why the world is as it is and why people are as they are. My interest eventually grew beyond him and took on a life of their own, but Malcolm has always remained the core.
Well, Paul Lee, thank you.
Thank you.